I welcome all of you. I am Gahl Burt. I am the chairman of the American Academy, and we have a lot of familiar faces here tonight. It's hard for me to believe, I pinch myself, our 37th class of fellows, our 18th year, and it felt like yesterday. Sometimes it still feels like yesterday, but I have the scars on my back to prove that it wasn't yesterday. I'd like to recognize the ambassador of Egypt, Ambassador Abdulladi, and we have my colleagues from the board here tonight are Nina von Maltzen, Hans Michael Giesen, John Kornblum, Volker Schlorndorf, and it's always a pleasure to welcome them back here. They come here often and they help us out a lot, but it's always nice to have their company. The Academy's new president, Michael Steinberg, unfortunately is in the United States undergoing medical treatment, and he was unable to come here for this. He really wanted to come. He sends his greetings. He will be back as soon as the doctors give him the green light, but it's not yet. So we hope to have him very soon. So, and in the meantime, while he's not here, though, we have two new people helping us, two new staff, Professor Thomas Ramos. Stand up, please, Thomas, our Director of Programs. And Jan Techau, who is the Director of our Holbrook Forum. September 26th, 18 years ago, we had a big ceremony out on the lawn out here, and our first class of fellows had the poet C.K. Williams and Kendall Thomas, the legal scholar, and of course Arthur Miller. And that was how we sort of kicked the whole thing off, was with Arthur Miller, who was quite something to be around. And we knew that we had a winning formula here. So many of you here tonight have been supporters of ours, both financial supporters and intellectual supporters and friends. You wouldn't be here if you hadn't been, and I thank you all for everything you've done for us. We are especially grateful to the Kellen Arnhold family, and Nina von Maltzen is here tonight, and we are in her ancestral home, and not for Nina, it would not look like this, and we would not be here. So Nina, thank you very much. Since our first class of fellows, we have provided temporarily an intellectual home for over 420 fellows, 220 distinguished visitors, hundreds of lectures, and more than 1,300 public events. It was our founder, Richard Holbrooke's, hope that the Academy would become a way station, really, for the best and the brightest of American minds, writers, artists, journalists, policy experts, scholars, and really from all academic disciplines. Richard knew that these individuals provided an image of America that was different from the image that he felt that a lot of Germans had of America, and he wanted something that was more than a 3-day conference to be present here in Berlin. The Cold War was over, and the Academy was to be a living sign of the American commitment to this great city. As you all know, America has a very complicated but firm commitment to And Richard knew it needed to change when the Berlin Brigade left, and he knew how he wanted the face of America to change in this city. And so when he approached Henry Kissinger to become a co-chairman, and Richard von Weizsäcker, they both readily said yes. Henry will tell you that you might as first he'll say, "Well, I was given no choice," but then he would say, if Richard asks you for money, you should say yes, because if you say no, you'll get to yes, but the journey will be very painful. And so they were a tag team. Dick would go ask for money, and they'd say no, and then Henry would come behind him and say, "You should say yes." And so it worked. And it was this spirit that had animated the Arnhold home in the 1930s, before that family was compelled to leave by forces allied against openness and civil society itself. It's worth quoting Anna Maria Kellen, who is now in her mid-90s. She, who spent her childhood years in this house, said on that September afternoon in 1998, "Although the appearance of the house may have altered, I believe the spirit of our home remains intact. The vitality and joy, the love of learning, and openness to all that life has to offer. It is my hope, as it is my family's, that this spirit will infuse the American Academy and energize all the young Americans who take up residence here." And so it is with Anna Maria's and Nina's family history in mind that we are proud to welcome Mazen Darwish this evening. He will introduce our fall class of fellows. Himself, he is a recent Berliner. Mazen is one of Syria's most prominent advocates for freedom of the press. He came to Berlin seeking exile. Mazen is the founder of the Syrian Center for Media and Freedom of Expression, which he founded in 2004, which also has observer status at the United Nations. He was awarded the Roland Berger Foundation Prize for Human Dignity in 2011, but he was not allowed to leave Syria to receive this award, and instead was arrested and imprisoned for almost 4 years. Through the untiring lobbying efforts of his wife, Yara Bader, who maybe some of you know, led to both a United Nations and an EU resolution to free him. He was released from prison in August 2015. After making his way to Lebanon, he was able to receive a special visa to Germany through the help of Germany's UN ambassador at the time, Harold Braun. Marie Warburg and Michael Naumann, who are here tonight, became his foster parents, and they continue to be his family here in Germany. So it's a nice story for everyone. Yeah. Despite these hardships, Mazen personifies the educated global citizen, the wanderer between worlds, open and inquisitive, modest and tolerant. He has a gift of making people see the differences and similarities between culturally determined worldviews. He is an extraordinary ambassador for the values of free expression. His efforts to help his homeland continue from his base in Berlin. In 2015, Mazen was awarded the UNESCO Guillermo Cano World Press Freedom Prize. In April 2016, he was honored with the Franklin D. Roosevelt For Freedoms Award for efforts to promote human rights and freedom of speech in Syria. Among his fellow laureates were Chancellor Angela Merkel and Human Rights Watch. So it is my honor to introduce to you Mazen Darwish this evening.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jill. And again, sorry for my borrow English. It's a great honor to be with you today. I came from Syria, and I spent the last 10 years stuck in Syria with a travel ban and without passport because of my working in human rights. But not anymore. After I came to Berlin last November, I start moving everywhere. My wife Yara in New York now, and so I will feel free to speak about our stories while she's not here. She's always complained of my continuous traveling, and every time I travel, she asks me, "Is this necessary?" And I always find hundreds of good reasons to explain to her the importance of my participate. But in fact, I just need to be sure that I am free and I'm not banned of travel anymore. Also, about 2 months ago, I was invited by Friedrich Ebert Foundation to participate in a seminar with a senior official in the German Foreign Ministry. And I was very sharp and direct in my criticism of the leak of German and European strategy on what is happening in my country, Syria, and in the Middle East. After the end of the ceremony, Yara told me that really you are a problem factory. What if they drove us out of Germany? Where are we going? I replied, confident, don't worry. This is not Syria. It's a democratic country. They will not drive us out. May probably just will not renew our residency. It's not easy to be without country, homeless in the world. But if you have a good family, like Marie and Michael, it will be more easy. Or to have banned from traveling or speech. So please, do not allow the loss of your rights. Your rights of freedom of belief, freedom of expression, freedom of movement. Democracy is not part of our democracy, it's a part of our humanity and not just a details. Dear friends, I have signed a statement 2 days ago with 150 Syrian writers and journalists. Please allow me to share with you a part of it. The world today heading toward an unprecedented naming of ethics. Level of fear and hatred escalate in parallel with the increasing visibility of politicians who investing the same feeling of fear, hatred, and isolations. We see democracy in retreat around the world, while monitoring, control, and fear are rife and advising. We do not believe that our fate is defined by this condition, but rather that these are a result of dangerous choices taken by dangerous political elite, and that we must work together to voice our opposition to them right now and everywhere we are. Thank you again to allow me to be here with you. This is the second time I'm here. The third time, I think I will start write poetry. And please, let me express my great honor to know the wonderful 12 fellow in 2016 and invite them to identify themselves.
Very fancy podium. Guten Abend. Sorry. My name is Alex Novikov, and I'm a New York-based historian, translator, and violinist. I am honored to be this semester's Nina Maria Garrison Fellow of History at the Academy. I'm trained as a historian of medieval European intellectual history, but I prefer to think of myself as a medievalist ohne Grenzen, a medievalist without borders, since my work effectively draws upon the disciplines of history, philosophy, the visual, theatrical, and musical arts, and performance theory. Fundamentally, I'm interested in the history of dialogue. Dialogue is something we hear and advocate every day, and so we presume to know what it is or what it is not. But until recently, there had been relatively little study of the history of dialogue as a social act, especially in the Middle Ages, when we presume that dogmatism and orthodoxy reigned supreme. In fact, all three Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, had a vigorous culture of dialogue and argumentation. In my first book, I attempted to write a cultural history of scholastic disputation. What is disputation, you might well ask? Very simply, disputation is the art of oral debate as it was practiced in the medieval university. I tried to show that the art of debate was not confined merely to university masters arguing how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, but that it extended well beyond the confines of the cloistered classroom and impacted a range of other cultural media, from interfaith polemics to secular poetry, manuscript illuminations, and early musical counterpoint. By the time I finished my project, I became convinced that the medieval art of debate was the conduit by which medieval scholars disseminated their ideas into the public sphere. In other words, intellectual debate was not confined to elites. Rather, it was a cultural practice that reached a large segment of society through channels both written and spoken, and through encounters both staged and improvised. Now, the concept of the public sphere is most famously associated with Jürgen Habermas's original analysis of the bourgeois public, and most especially with the largely secular developments in the early modern period. But medievalists have been skeptical of the exaltation of the 18th century that comes at the expense of the medieval world. So in my project here at the Academy, I will continue to explore how the scholastic world was one of intellectual exchange and participation, of drama, of performance, and to show that there was a public sphere in the Middle Ages. Having completed one book on the cultural history of disputation, I intend my second book to be devoted to its supposed antithesis, harmony. After all, one of the favorite maxims of the High Middle Ages was concordia discourse, or harmony from disharmony. This simple yet profound statement seems well worth recalling in our modern age of academic, political, and theatrical discord, because understanding something about the medieval history of debate and harmony might just help us understand something about today. So I look forward to much dialogue in my semester here in Berlin. Thank you.
My name is Rebecca Bowling, and I am a 20th century German historian. I'm honored to be the Bertold Reibinger Fellow here this fall. I came to the topic of my project via my first book on the US occupation of Germany after the defeat of the Nazi regime, A Question of Priorities, Democratic Reform, and Economic Recovery in Post-War Germany, which focused on US planning for post-war Germany. but also on the return of self-government to the Germans. I look specifically at 3 cities in the US zone of occupation, Frankfurt, Munich, and Stuttgart, which of course got me interested in the practice of denazification by both military government with its Fragebogen and the German tribunals. Thereafter, I began work on a book on US denazification in theory and practice, but I got waylaid by a fascinating collection of family letters written by different members and generations of a German Jewish family from Essen on the eve of, during, and after the Holocaust. This book, Life and Loss in the Shadow of the Holocaust, appeared in 2011, and just as I was about to return to the denazification project, I was recruited to become the first historian to direct the International Tracing Service, or ITS, in Bad Arolsen. The ITS was founded by the Allies, and since 1955, funded by the German government, but governed by an international commission of 11 nations to preserve millions of documents from concentration and labor camps and displaced persons files to document the fate of the victims of the Nazis. After 3 years of directing the ITS, I returned to the University of Maryland. My research interest has once again returned to denazification, but has become more comparative, both geographically and across time. This means my project, my first focused on Berlin, looks at the denazification practices of all 3 allies after World War II, Western allies after World War II in Berlin, where all the allies were present and interacted with each other and with the German population over the contentious topic of denazification. Usually when we think of denazification, we think of punishment and a purge of dangerous or at least incriminated elements from political influence, and less about transitional justice. Recent examples of transitional justice approaches from South Africa to Eastern Europe and the Middle East consciously have pursued reconciliation in the midst of creating systems to confront the past and to seek truth and justice. These cases now inform how I am thinking about post-World War II denazification. I am very pleased to be able to finally pursue this topic, especially here in Berlin, with great access to library holdings and in close proximity to the Landesarchiv. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Tom Franklin, and I'm the Mary Ellen von der Heyden Fellow in Fiction. I'm also an Associate Professor of English and Creative Writing at the University of Mississippi. I was born in tiny, rural Dickinson, Alabama, population 300, and I'm the son of an automotive mechanic. My brother is also a mechanic. My uncles are. My cousins are. I'm the only one in my family who went to college. But because of my background, I often feel pulled in 2 directions, as if I have 1 foot each in 2 different worlds. I feel this as a writer, too. I grew up loving to read, yet the books I read were not great literature, but the pulp novels of Edgar Rice Burroughs and the horror novels of Stephen King. It took me almost 9 years to earn my BA degree because I paid for it myself, worked my way through college. I drove heavy equipment at a sandblasting plant. I cleaned up hazardous waste at a chemical site. I rolled corpses around in a hospital morgue. At some point, I read an interview with Stephen King, who said that his fiction is the literary equivalent of a Big Mac and French fries. And I understood then that if I wanted to be a writer, I needed a better literary diet. My first book, Poachers is a collection of short stories. Their genre, I thought, was literary fiction or Southern Gothic. But then, one of these stories won the Edgar Allan Poe Award for Best Mystery Story. My second book, the novel Hell at the Breach, is set in Alabama in the 1890s and was reviewed as historical fiction. My third book, the novel Smunk, is considered a Western. My fourth, the novel Crooked Letter, was reviewed as a crime thriller and won the LA Times Book Award for Mystery Thriller. My most recent novel, co-written with my wife, Beth Ann Finley, who's here in the audience, is The Tilted World, and it's basically a love story. And finally, my current project, the one I'm laboring over on these lovely grounds, is, I suppose, a horror novel. Which returns me to Stephen King. Mr. King has said that literary fiction is about extraordinary people in ordinary circumstances, and that commercial fiction is about ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. What I attempt in my writing and in my life is to reconcile the different worlds that tug at me, to write about extraordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. And now, here I am in this extraordinary place among extraordinary people, feeling very fortunate. I thank the trustees, the staff of the American Academy in Berlin for this amazing gift. Thank you.
Now we get to the shorter fellows, with some exceptions still to come. My name is Mary Ann Doan, and I am one of the Anna Maria Kellen Fellows here at the American Academy. In my other life, to which I am less and less inclined to return after only a few weeks here at the Academy, I teach film and media at the University of California, Berkeley. Before I joined Berkeley in 2011, I taught at Brown University, where I helped to found the Department of Modern Culture and Media. I have written on feminist film theory, psychoanalysis, sound in the cinema, media archaeology, and the representation of catastrophe on television. My first book was on the American women's films of the 1940s, a genre produced during World War II under the assumption that audiences would be primarily composed of women, a genre we generally think of as the melodrama or the weepy. My second book was a collection of essays on feminist film theory organized around the figure of the femme fatale, the mysterious, unknowable, and unreliable cinematic character usually associated with film noir. The woman who never is what she appears to be and therefore constitutes an epistemological problem. The focus of my third book moved more towards media archaeology, the attempt to produce a different, non-teleological understanding of the history of techniques of representation and their relation to various early technologies, the microscope, the phonograph, photography, and film. I was particularly interested in the early cinema's structuring of temporality. The book's name is The Emergence of Cinematic Time, and its privileged relation to contingency and modernity. The book analyzes early films and discourses about film in relation to contemporary scientific and philosophical discourses about time, emphasizing the growing anxiety about modernity's annihilation of traditional categories of space and time. My project here at the Academy, which is tentatively entitled Bigger Than Life, is on cinematic space and scale, concentrating on the close-up as perhaps the most excessive filmic technique in terms of scalar disproportion. The close-up has also privileged the human face, something we tend to take for granted, and this has had a major impact on our understanding of the legibility of that face and its role in relation to questions of identity, beauty, and individuality. What happens when the face-to-face encounter, previously associated with presence, authenticity, and transparency, is subject to greater and greater mediation by new technologies and the proliferation of screens? The second emphasis of this project is on the scale of the screen itself. For years, the aspect ratio and even the size of the cinematic screen have remained fairly constant, but the advent of television, widescreen cinemas, and now screens as large as IMAX and as small as mobile phones have greatly increased the variety of screen experiences and effects. I am very grateful to the American Academy for giving me the time and space to hopefully complete this project. Thank you.
There we go. Good evening. My name is Charles Haberl, and I too am honored to be an Anna Maria Kellen Fellow here at the American Academy. I was brought here by my research into the Sabaeans, formerly of Iraq and Iran, who were popularly known as the Mandeans. This community, the original followers of John the Baptist, is the last surviving sect of Gnostics from the ancient Near East. This is a branch of the faith once represented in Europe by groups such as the Cathars, and which at one point flourished all the way from northern Africa to southern China, but today finds itself on the brink of extinction. My own involvement with the Mandeans begins in 1999, when as a doctoral candidate, I helped to organize the first International Mandean Congress in Boston, the centerpiece of which was the first ever Mandean baptism in the New World, held along the banks of the River Charles. The embryonic Mandean American community welcomed me into their homes. And early in the year 2003, I moved to the borough of Queens in the city of New York to commence my own fieldwork into their language, which is a highly endangered dialect of the Aramaic language formerly spoken in the swamps of southern Iraq. One of the results of this work was the documenting of the rich Mandean corpus of folklore, the most famous of which is the legend of the Bridge of Shustar. In this account, the Mandean community there is persecuted by a tyrant who seeks to wrest control of an ancient and powerful demon from deep beneath the soil of his country. This enrages the demon, and so he destroys the whole city, leveling it to the ground, and then he lifts up the entire Mandean quarter of the city and carries it off to safety in the west. At the close of the legend, the Muslim inhabitants of the city gather around the gaping pit that is suddenly formed where the Mandeans used to live, and they turn to one another and they say, "This is the gap left by the disappearance of the Sabaeans from our country." Now, obviously this legend can lend itself to multiple interpretations, but for me and for the community that I study, it acquired a new significance with the coalition invasion of Iraq in 2003. You see, up until the 19th century, it was accepted as an article of faith by the most reputable Muslim scholars that the Mandeans were none other than the fourth people of the book, the somewhat enigmatic Sabia. And therefore, a truly Islamic state was obligated to protect them from religious persecution. It was at that point that Western Orientalists, and above all else, those here in Germany, started to cast aspersions on the Mandeans' own narratives about their history, often with little or no evidence. Now, the quibbles of German Orientalists might have been a philological footnote to history, but with the lawlessness that attended the invasion of Iraq and the rise of a new sectarianism, the self-styled Islamic authorities of Iraq have declared an open season upon the Mandeans and many other religious minorities. Within a few years, their 2 millennia-long history in southern Iraq came to an end. And where did they go? They went up north to the area around Mosul, and they also found themselves in the refugee camps of Syria. As we would say in English, from the frying pan into the fire, or as you might say in Syria, zifet maghli. Today, these refugees are increasingly seeking to reestablish a new life here in Germany and elsewhere in the West. And my purpose is to document how they balance the demands of their new host societies with respect for their own ancient traditions, and how their rich folklore, such as the Bridge of Shushtar, can help them to inform this balance. Thank you very much.
Can I drink from this? Guten Abend. Ich spreche keine Deutsch. That was it. Good evening. My name is Ioana Uricaru, and I have many identities, one of them being the Dirk Ippen Fellow of the Academy, for which I'm very grateful. Thank you very much to the Academy, to the trustees, and to the wonderful staff who organized this beautiful evening. Some of my other identities are, I was trained as a scientist, then I was trained as a filmmaker, then I was trained as an academic scholar. I was born Romanian. I always felt European. Now I'm becoming American. I survived communism, I survived immigration, and now I'm trying to survive the process of tenure at Middlebury College in the US. And through all these trials and tribulations, I found that the thing that I'm most interested in and that really constitutes the focus of all my intellectual work, both as an artist and as a scholar, is the importance, or indeed the primacy, of the personal experience. And I looked at it from the point of view of neuroscience, from the point of view of a scholar, but most importantly from the point of view of a filmmaker. The project that I'm working on here is a feature film. I am writing it now and I will direct it eventually, so it's a fiction film that brings together many facets of my identity. It is centered around the figure of a fictitious but inspired by reality German scientist at the end of the Second World War. It is set in the summer of 1945 in the south of Germany. It asks some questions, or it deals with some issues that are many times the subject of academia, like geopolitics and history and policy. But above everything, and the thing that I'm most fond of, and the identity I would pick if I had to pick one, is that of storyteller. So this is first and foremost a story. And in terms of story, what I'm really interested in is exploring the things that usually don't make it into the stories, the things that usually don't end up on the screen, the little things, the details, the things that are in the interstices of reality and that sometimes get, or most times, get cut out and they never end up in the drama. You can think about it as putting a magnifying glass against the fabric of reality and really looking at the texture and the color and the fibers and the irregularities and the specks of dust. If anybody has ever been on a date, you know how it's like when you're on a date and there's silence, there's no conversation, and one or both people are really trying to say something to fill the silence. What I'm interested in is what happens when you let that silence actually happen, the things that might be uncomfortable, that we tend to avoid, that we tend to dismiss. An interesting thing that I discovered is that when you commit to an aesthetic strategy like this one, it turns out that it's actually an ethical choice. And I invite you to come back on December 1st when I'm going to do my presentation so that we can talk more about ethics and storytelling and people. Thank you very much.
I'd just like to spend a moment playing around with this podium. It's an extraordinary piece of equipment, Thomas. I don't know if you're responsible for this purchase, but the fact that one can, we're academics, we like to self-elevate, so this is... Good evening, everyone. My name is Michael Watts. I'm the Siemens Fellow. and I want to begin by acknowledging the generous support of the Siemens Foundation that's permitted me to be here at this wonderful location. I hold an appointment at the University of California at Berkeley. My formal title, if you're interested, is the Class of 63 Professor. I've taught for almost 40 years there. I've only ever had one job in my life. In the Earth Sciences and Development Studies program there, and for 10 years of those 40, I directed a large research institute called the Institute of International Studies. All of my working life has been in the United States, but I'm a British citizen. That means to say I'm a former European. Late in my life, I have become a little Englander. I just want to say that I'm happy to talk to any of you this evening, but please do not mention the word Brexit in my presence, and certainly not the word Boris Johnson. I was born in a small village. I share a rural background with Tommy Franklin, not of 300, but of 20 people. The house didn't have running water or electricity. I went up in the late 1960s to read economics and geography at London, an experience from which I've not recovered. I discovered left politics, from which I've not recovered. And when I graduated, I went to Africa, building schools and teaching and working for a food relief organization, from which I also have not recovered. I intended to go back to Cambridge for graduate work, but in fact I dropped out, shipped out to the Midwest in America for my graduate studies, thinking that it was close to my aunt in Seattle. It was in fact 2,000 miles away, and I had a geographical lesson right there. I was appointed in Berkeley in the late 1970s. I live in San Francisco with my unruly 15-year-old daughter, who was attending school here in Mita, and my equally unruly wife, who is a professor also. We have an equally unruly son, who is a professional ballet dancer. I am a beekeeper, about which I could talk. I am a lifelong supporter of Liverpool Football Club. And I realize that there are people here who will be supporting Bayern and Dortmund, and I apologize in advance. No, they're good. This season is our season. Thank you, sir. They are. I have, over the 40 years, worked on many, many things. I've written on and worked in and around African issues, food and famine, poverty, political conflict. I've written books on all of those sorts of things. I've also written, I share an interest with Thomas Rommel, in utopian and communal movements in California in particular. I have a deep and abiding, and I've written on, interest in photography, German photography in particular. Olga Sander, the early Bauhaus photographers, Thomas Struth. In other words, I am a dilettante. I am a jack of all trades and a master of none. In view of that menagerie of interests, you may see what in England we would call a dog's breakfast. What is the appeal for me being in Berlin? Well, one thing, the immediate response would be to say to be as far away from Donald Trump as is humanly possible. And that is true in my case, but there are three very compelling reasons for me to be here. One is I'm a geographer by training, and of course, post-Enlightenment and modern geography is a German invention. From Kant, of course, von Humboldt, Ritter, Hettner. And I've been fortunate to work with German geographers in my career, the late Professor Bühler in particular of Heidelberg and Bonn, and I wish to extend those connections here. A second is that I can think of no more interesting place in the world to be right now than in Europe. I don't have to tell you this, the future of Europe is in question. With the rise of all sorts of authoritarian populist movements and some movements that can only be described as fascist, I think the whole question of Europe is in question. And whatever that future of Europe will be, Germany will play a foundational role in it. And what better place to be than in Berlin to discuss those issues? And last but not least, I have a personal reason, which is that my father left school at 14. He joined the Royal Navy in 1939. At 17, he served on a big battle cruiser, the HMS Anson. It arrived after the dropping of the bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. When he was demobbed, he ended up, very unusually from someone of his generation, working for a German company. It brought him to the Ruhr. It brought him to Essen. It brought him to Berlin. And I'd like to think, wherever my father may be right now, he died 25 years ago, would appreciate my being here. Lastly but not least, let me thank the Academy and the staff for their extraordinary generosity and their kindnesses to my wife and my daughter. It's the type of generosity that generates embarrassment because I know I could never repay that generosity. And it's going to be difficult to leave. And if Donald Trump wins, we won't be leaving. Thank you very much.
Okay. Hello, my name is Ezra Akcan, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Architecture at Cornell University, and the Ellen Maria Gorissan Fellow at the Academy this fall. It's wonderful to be back in Berlin, a city where I have lived quite a few times in the past 13 years, while conducting research for my doctoral dissertation and my first book on German-Turkish relations in modern architecture, as well as for my current book. Arriving at the American Academy prompted me to think of the previous Berlin apartments that I stayed in, and I realized I must have lived at least once in all of the city's different architectural types, such as the unrenovated 19th century rental barracks, the Mietskasernen, when they used to be heated with coal-operated stoves, and then the renovated 19th century Mietskasernen all over the central city, which are part of my current book. I also lived in the world-renowned social housing units of the Weimar period, designed by Bruno Taut, that I had analyzed for my first book, and the Unité d'Habitation by Le Corbusier, to have an idea why mid-century modernists were criticized by subsequent generations that I'm working on. I stayed in the former embassies of East Berlin, even though it's an anomaly I didn't write on them, but I'm now writing about the social housing projects of Kreuzberg, where I lived while doing research for my current book, Open Architecture. This book explores the concept of the open as a common metaphor in the era of global connections and as a foundational modern value, even if prone to contradictions. I define open architecture as a translation of a new ethics of hospitality into design process. An ethics of hospitality that is not necessarily Kantian, something that takes off from Levinasian hospitality, perhaps. And I exemplify different inclinations towards open architecture, or the lack thereof, during the urban renewal of Berlin's immigrant neighborhood, Kreuzberg. An astonishingly large number of established and cutting-edge architects were invited from all over Europe and the United States for this development, carried out by the building exhibition IBA during the 1980s. At the time, the rundown Kreuzberg along the Berlin Wall had a population composed of almost 50% non-citizens, predominantly from Turkey, who had arrived as guest workers since 1961 or as refugees after being forced out of citizenship due to the coup d'etat in 1980. And with recent events, I find myself working on even a more urgent topic for more than one reason. I write about this urban development not only as a microcosm of the history of social housing and of the international architectural debates from the mid-1960s till the 1990s, but also to expose the contradictory relations between cities, international immigration policies, and the current human rights regime. This requires giving voice, I think, not only to architects and policymakers, but also to non-citizens, which I have tried to excavate in recent years by ringing every doorbell in Kreuzberg before the original residents left due to the neighborhood's ongoing gentrification, a relatively late gentrification compared to other central locations of unified Berlin, thanks to the social housing status given during the years that my book covers. So even though I just claim to have lived in all of Berlin's residential types, arriving at the American Academy, I realized that I have actually not seen all. Little did I know that while I was sweating in the archives and on social housing sites, Berliners were swimming and sailing on the lake or taking long bike rides in miles and miles of forests within the city borders. I'm extremely grateful to be given this opportunity to finish my book manuscript in this writer's paradise, where I can actually take a 15-minute train ride to my topic, or fully concentrate in the wonderful Fellows Pavilion designed by architects Barkow and Leibinger, where I can get my library books without even leaving the office, where I'm being fed with gourmet meals, and where I don't even have to turn on the lights as they turn on by themselves. I should say it will be a challenge to stay appropriately critical of the historical immigration policies and contemporary refugee phenomenon here, but a challenge I'm honored to take. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Timothy Scott Brown. I am a historian. I'm a professor of history at Northeastern University in Boston, and I am Bosch Fellow in Public Policy here at the American Academy, and I'm delighted by the idea that I, as a historian, might have some influence on public policy. So I have a long-standing relationship with Berlin. I came here first at the beginning of the 90s as a tourist. I came in 1996 as a Fulbright Fellow at the University of Potsdam, and then again as a Fulbright Fellow in 2004 at the Free University, and have made many small trips to Berlin and Germany in between. And so I've really seen the startling changes that have taken place in Berlin over these couple of decades. And I don't just work in the city of Berlin. I work on modern German and European history more generally, but much of my work does focus on Berlin, and so I feel like my work really traces the changes that have taken place in the city. I'm a historian of radical mass movements, a historian of the politics of culture, cultural politics, radical arts, alternative media, and I'm concerned especially with issues of bottom-up democracy, politics of knowledge, and as mentioned previously, alternative media. I've worked on popular music and a number of other sort of outline topics in the history of radical politics, which I show are not in fact outline at all. My first book is called Weimar Radicals, and it's about the rise of National Socialism in Germany, and specifically with the relationship between the radical extremes in the late Weimar Republic and early Third Reich. My second single-authored book that came out just a couple of years ago and has recently come out in paperback is West Germany and the Global 60s. And this book deals with the phenomenon of 1968 in West Germany and places German events in global and transnational perspective. I've co-authored a number of essay collections and also a variety of essays and chapters on quite a range of topics, ranging from fascism in the 1920s and 30s, left-wing subcultures in the 60s and 70s, right-wing extremist youth subcultures in the 1980s and 90s, Turkish hip-hop in Berlin in the 1990s, and the intertwined histories of left-wing radicalism in East and West Germany from the 1960s on. And I did publish a few years back an essay on 1968 in East and West Germany, a comparative essay in the American Historical Review. And my new project that I'm working on here at the Academy also deals with German history. And it's called The Greening of Cold War Germany, Environmentalism and Social Movements Across the Wall and Beyond, 1968 to 1989. And so here I move out of my work in the 1960s and 70s into work on the following period, the 70s and 80s, and I move from studying radical social movements to, in a way, to continuing to study radical social movements, but in this case I'm moving into the history of environmentalism. And I use the term environmentalism in the title of the book, not in the strict sense of green politics, but in a slightly broader sense of a reconfiguration of radical politics that thinks of the world, finds new ways of thinking about the world in terms of thinking of the world as an indissoluble whole, thinking about mankind's place in the world and the cosmos, and so not just focusing on, for example, the class struggle or classical Marxism, but thinking about new categories of radical analysis. So one thing this book does is it's going to provide an unwritten chapter in German history, because we don't really have a book that covers the Greens in both Germanys. And one of the things it's going to do is it's going to take the history of the opposition in the GDR and globalize it in a way, because I connect the formation of these two green movements in the two Germanys with broader developments in the world. I expose the relationship even if people sort of laboring in obscurity behind the wall, their relationship to wider movements around the world, the peace, anti-nuclear movements, and so on. And so this work, third, will contribute to sort of tracing the continuation of the social movements post-1968 into a new politics, which I think is not yet fully unfolded and could prove to be quite important in our era, our own era of global climate change and unresolved issues of war and peace. So I'm very grateful to be here at the Academy to work on this, and I want to thank the American Academy for giving me this opportunity. And I want to echo the praise of some others about the incredibly wonderful, obviously, environment, but also the staff who are fantastic and the colleagues who I'm grateful to be here in the class with. And I will say in conclusion then that apropos of my interest in radical print culture in the 1960s, there's an essay coming out in the forthcoming Berlin Journal, which is the Journal of the American Academy. So you can look for that if that interests you. So thank you.
It's my turn to play with the podium. One of the first pieces of advice my Dr. Vater gave me about speaking in public was to tell me that I had to be sure that people could see me over the podium, which at my height you cannot take for granted, so I like this toy. I am Jennifer Davis. I'm a medieval historian from Washington, D.C., and I'm delighted to be in Berlin this fall as the John P. Birkeland Fellow in the Humanities. I am delighted to be in Berlin for a number of reasons, but perhaps the most important of them is that being in this particular place gives me a chance to get up and close with the actual sources of the history that I study. And again, when you're an early medievalist, this is another thing that I can't take for granted, like being able to see over podiums. So most of what I'm going to be doing with my time here in Berlin is to work at the manuscript reading room of the Staatsbibliothek, where I'm going to be working with a collection of legal manuscripts that contain laws issued by Frankish kings who ruled pretty much most of Western Europe. These laws tell us a lot about, like any other kind of normative source, what kings wanted to have happen. They tell us about aspiration. But it is true for all of us, including kings, that you can't always get what you want. I should make the Rolling Stones, I think, the theme song for this book project. So there's always the question when you work with legal material, implementation, effectiveness. Okay, kings can say whatever they wanted, but so what? What happens with it? And what I've become interested in looking at with these manuscripts is I think they can tell me a story about reception of law. Because interestingly enough, in spite of the fact that the Frankish kings issued a lot of laws, they really didn't control the dissemination or copying of those laws. And yet we have several hundred manuscripts that survive. These manuscripts were copied by various individuals and communities who chose to write them down for their own reasons. And that's what I'm interested in studying. And to do that, I actually look at the manuscripts themselves as cultural objects, as books. So how is a law laid out on a page? What is it put next to? How do you actually bind the manuscript? What are the little notes in the margins? What pages of the parchments are dirty? What are people reading? What are they crossing out? What are they adding to? And I'm going to use this as a way then of tracing how this sort of set of royal expectation gets put into practice and lived with by people throughout the Frankish world. The manuscripts, though, aren't the only things that I'm going to get to touch while I'm here in Berlin. One other thing that I'm excited about seeing is the collection of coins of the Carolingians, the most famous of the Frankish dynasties, of which there is a very large collection in Berlin. I'm interested in coinage both for sort of representation of rulership, the things you put on a coin that expresses itself, as well as for the kinds of economic control that we see through the ways in which the coinage changes over time. But I'll give you just one little example of what I hope to do with this coinage. My first book was a study of Charlemagne, Karl der Große, and towards the very end of his reign, Charlemagne issued a portrait coinage with a picture of him on it. These coins are very, very rare. There are, I think the latest list I saw, there's 45, we may have gotten to 46, known in the world. Of this class of coin, a full 20% of the known specimens are in Berlin. this image of Charlemagne on this coin is the only secure contemporary depiction of him that we have. So for me, I spent more years of my life than I'd like to admit to writing a book about that man. And the only way that I actually know what he looks like is from that coin. And the fact that I'm going to get to hold one is a tremendous privilege. So thank you for the opportunity.
Let's see. Oh. We're gonna test last but not least theory here and see what happens. Excuse me for 1 second. Good. Let's see. Okay.
Guten Abend, Erdelinge. Guten Abend, Erdelinge.
Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Daniel Joseph Martinez. I'm an artist. I live and work in Los Angeles and in Paris. I'm also a professor, the Donald Bren Professor of Art at the University of California, Irvine. Perhaps what I would like to do for you in the few moments that I have is, rather than to describe the project that I am going to be undertaking here in Berlin, I'm going to try to render an image of a practice. In other words, what it means to be an artist, or perhaps more precisely, what it means to live a life of experimentation. So I'm going to give you just a little bit of geopolitical context so you understand perhaps what some of the motivation is. Where I live in Los Angeles, I was born and raised there. I grew up in, not dissimilar to many of my colleagues, which there is a surprising overlap amongst my distinguished scholars that I am here with, both in origin and in content. But I grew up in the inner city. I grew up in what would be considered government housing. I grew up in what would, in most other countries in the world, be described as a war zone. It is not a kind of condition that anybody would wish upon anyone, but nonetheless, it is a place that I was born. I currently live in South Los Angeles, which is, ironically, one is the epicenter of the 1992 riots. It simultaneously is the epicenter of West Coast gangster rap and West Coast hip hop. So you have a cultural exchange that is going on between an ethical and a principled position, trying to examine both the politics of race and the politics of class simultaneously. My home in Paris with my wife, I live in the 19th district, and ironically I live in Stalingrad, which has come to bear a new meaning being here in Berlin, given my examination of both the East and the West and the current sort of geopolitical status of this place. My propensity is to want to exist outside of identity and outside of categories. But for the sake of argument, I would say that I oscillate somewhere between what is described as an aesthetic practice called tactical magic and something that Hakim Bey, the writer, describes as a temporary autonomous zone. In between these two spaces allow for a type of freedom and an investigation of both subject and object in a manner that is not previously sort of, I would argue, understood, because of the manner in which one arrives at this is completely nonlinear, asymmetrical, propositional, and it is dependent upon one existing in both a conscious and an unconscious state simultaneously. So in other words, here, I mean, I'm imagining as I'm listening, I'm thinking of Bobby Fischer, and Bobby Fischer was a fan of speed chess, which is essentially what we have just done. We have just had 12 games of speed chess for you, and we're ranging between 3 and 5 minutes. He argued that this was the optimum position by which to both be imaginative, to have a kind of creativity and a kind of predetermined intellectual position that allowed him to test the tenets of his ideas. Something that is peculiar to me and something that I think is pertinent, that we have entered the age of the intelligent machine. And as human beings, we seem to be unwilling, or we living in a delusional state where we are not recognizing our own demise. This machine is obsolete. The mind that we use will be very soon outdated. And in this age of intelligent machine, or what would be referred to as the technological sublime, that we have to ask, or we have to go backwards perhaps and ask the most fundamental question, which I think we have forgotten. What is human? What is human in the 21st century? Or maybe more precisely, what does it mean to be a human being? Because if you look at the condition of the world that we live, it is impossible to imagine that we are constantly caught in the cyclical state. We repeat over and over again. It seems that what we are best at is self-destruction. And we seem to not learn from that self-destruction by which to position ourselves or to create a paradigm that would allow us to live in another way. Where I live in Paris, in Stalingrad, it is a refugee camp. It is an unofficial refugee camp, and you cannot step outside of my door and not look at just the horrific conditions that have been allowed to transpire there. Somehow, my life and my sort of desire to derive through the world is constantly stopped because I have to pay attention to the world that I live in. In other words, that there is a moral imperative. It is impossible to not act, and it is impossible to not exist in a condition where there is a consequence to our action. To be passive or to be neutral is no longer possible. If we rely on this, we rely on something that leaves us in a position that is untenable, and it is not sustainable as a human being. I have no idea how much time I have left. None. I have no time left. Not one story? One tiny little story. Okay, so when I was a little boy, I was completely confused, 8 years old. But we had the happiest place on earth, which is called Disneyland, right? And if it's true that our experiences in life are the formation of who we are, they had extraordinary. Abraham Lincoln was alive. And he would stand up and deliver the Gettysburg Address over and over and over again. You could be shrunk and be injected into a human body and see molecules, or you could fly into space. But what was more fantastic, you had the Matterhorn, and you had this character called Tinkerbell. And she used to fly from the top of the Matterhorn down to the electric light parade. And so there I am, 8 years old, and I'm there with my parents because it was a special treat on one's birthday. And Tinkerbell is flying down, and then you hear people go, ah, and the cable that she was flying on breaks, and pop, right in front of me, she just hits the ground. Tinkerbell died. It's an impossibility to have Tinkerbell die. But nonetheless, that perhaps is why I am the way that I am. So anyway, thank you.
Dear friends of the Academy, with this wonderful anecdote which we can discuss and debate outside and inside, I'd like to close the presentation of the Fall 2016 Fellows. And this was a tremendous success, I must say. This was a wonderful event. I thank you all for being here. And now we'd like to invite you all to step outside or into the next room, join us in conversation, join the fellows in conversation, talk to them, see when they're giving their special, if you like, speeches and lectures, attend them, go to them, draw them out. There's much more where this came from. This is a fantastic group of fellows, I must say. As the new boy in this house, I can say it's been a phenomenal experience working with you, and I've only been here for 10 days. How is this going to continue? So this evening is your evening. We'll open the doors right now. There'll be food and drink and merry conversation, and you have all the time in the world to ask all the questions you always wanted to know from these delightful 12 people. Thank you, and enjoy the evening.